Welcome to the fourth event in this year's Energy Symposium series, Critical Issues in Energy. Tonight's topic is Energy Infrastructure, Bottleneck or Enabler. I'm Ramanand Krishnamurthy, the Chief Energy Officer here at the University of Houston. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate you all joining virtually for this symposium. We do understand that these are trying times and greatly appreciate your presence here. We have an excellent panel and moderator, and I'd like to thank everyone for their participation tonight. I'd like to especially call out our media partners, the Houston Public Media, who have helped spread the word about the symposium through many of their pieces online as well as on the air. I'd like to recognize the President's Energy Advisory Board. The board is made of industry experts and leaders who give UH and UH Energy strategic guidance to advance energy education, research, and outreach. This effort of the symposium is a substantial part of what we do in terms of our outreach and education efforts. I'd like to thank the other UH faculty, energy fellows, who also contribute to these symposia, as well as other UH energy programs and events throughout the year. A special thanks to my colleagues out here from UH's Information Technology Office here. They are doing yeoman's work to put this together and greatly appreciate their help and support. I also want to thank the staff at UH Energy, especially Lauren Kibler, without whose help this symposium would not be happening today. A few quick notes about this event. We are currently live streaming this event. We will archive this video of the panel discussion and will make that available on YouTube about a week from today. We encourage you to submit your questions for the panel throughout this program via the link that you will see on the screen. The link will appear periodically on the screen and can be found on the UH Energy website. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dave Fehling from the Houston Public Media. Dave is the news director at News 88.7, the local national public radio station in Houston. He has led changes to reshape the newsroom culture and sharpen the focus of the station's newscasts and talk shows in order to promote hard-hitting journalism in the nation's sixth largest radio market. Dave joined Houston Public Media after 3 decades as a television reporter and anchor in Houston and as a staff correspondent for CBS News. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from DePauw University. Without further ado, Dave Fehling.
Thank you, Ramanand. I really appreciate that. I think, as you touched on, I wish we were doing this in person, but the U of H campus, like so many, is largely shut down right now. Over at the NPR station, where I'm the news director at Houston Public Media, we have got our hands full. A lot of us are working at home, as I am right now. All the reporters are working from home, as many of you are. So it's a whole new world out there. I don't know if you happened to catch the NPR story earlier today about they found a number of different people around the country, people who'd been, say, out on a whitewater rafting trip for the past 2 weeks and just, been out of touch, completely cut off. And yesterday found out, what was going on. So you can only imagine what that must have been like for people that had no idea how the world had changed so much in just a couple of weeks. And what's interesting about this is this afternoon, we're going to be talking about energy infrastructure and baseload generation and energy transition. Almost seems like escapism, given what so many of us are facing right now. So who needs Netflix? Well, a few years ago, I was reporting for an NPR project called State Impact. And we did stories like, if we can pull that next slide up, how new transmission lines are bringing more wind power to Texas cities, and how a Houston company could store energy in the ground. Imagine that. And we can switch to the next slide, 2 more there. Let's see if we can go on down. I don't think I have control of it, so I have to switch the slides for me. And to the next one, please. Yeah, this was a good one. How much oil is stored in Houston? And is it harmful to our health? And the answer to that is, depends on where you live, but yes, it actually can be harmful to your health. But you might see a pattern here with the stories that we've been covering over the years. Whether it was wind turbines in Corpus or fracking in the Permian, there was a huge increase in the amount of energy being produced in Texas. But how to move all that energy had become an enormous problem. A problem, but also maybe an opportunity. And that and other related issues is what we'll be talking about this afternoon as we tackle our topic, energy infrastructure, bottleneck or enabler. And to do that, we have a great panel of experts with diverse perspectives that should make for a really lively discussion this afternoon. From them, you may hear about national projects to move wind and solar energy, projects that ultimately failed. We may also hear about new pipeline projects that would have transported oil and natural gas that instead got hung up for so long that over time, some states that initially wanted the projects ended up turning against them. And we may hear about the deregulated Texas energy market. It has lots of challenges. To quote from a post on NRG's website, that was the previous slide there, the grid is not static. Infrastructure is built in one location to ease congestion, but it appears in others as new economic activity springs up or more distributed energy is developed. So it's kind of a whack-a-mole thing. It's really tough to keep up with. Whack-a-mole is my one word, not NRG's. So is the Texas electricity market, ERCOT, up to the challenge? Might it be even an effective approach to climate change? Some on our panel are big fans of ERCOT. Others, not in the least. All right, so let's meet our panel. First, also, let's make mention of this right away. This is how you get your questions in. You can address them to me. You'll see you'll have a selection there to myself or to any of the panelists. uh.edu/energy/ask. That is how you can submit your questions, and you can do that anytime. We encourage you to do that as soon as possible. All right, let's meet our panel. First up, Christine Tezak. She is the managing director at Clearview Energy Partners. She leads the company's work on electricity markets, interstate pipelines, energy infrastructure, and federal environmental policy. Drawing upon more than 2 decades of experience in the electric, utility, and natural gas pipeline sectors. Now, prior to joining Clearview, Christine was a senior research analyst at Robert W. Baird & Company and a senior vice president with the Washington Research Group. She has testified before FERC and before Congress. Next up, John Hall. John is Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs at the Environmental Defense Fund. John leads EDF's clean energy efforts in Texas, promoting the use of clean energy resources and the electrification of the public and private vehicle fleet. He previously served as Executive Director for the Texas Environmental Research Consortium in Houston. John was also chairman of the Texas Water Commission and the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission, which are what is now the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And our third panelist, Ed Hers. Ed is the BDO Natural Resources Fellow and a lecturer of economics at the University of Houston. He previously served as the managing director at Hill House Resources, which is an independent E&P company developing onshore conventional oil and gas discoveries here in Texas. You've probably read his opinion pieces in the Houston Chronicle and other major publications. He writes about energy markets and corporate governance. Ed has also founded and co-chairs an annual energy conference at Yale University. All right, let's get going here now. Let's hear from each of you, each of the 3 panelists, for a few minutes to kind of set things up here. Christy, let's start with you. And don't forget to unmute.
Unmuting, there we go. Sorry about that. So just to give you a quick introduction to who we are here at Clearview, we're a Washington, D.C. based research firm that helps financial investors and corporate strategists understand how legislation, regulation, and politics impacts primarily publicly traded companies. And what we try to do is help them understand sort of the realm of possibilities that could happen in order to facilitate their decision making. We're analysts, we're not lobbyists. We don't advocate for a particular position, whether it's on behalf of our clients or for partisan interests. We just try to provide the sort of the realm of possibility to keep that, to make it easier to determine risk. Let's see, and I'll get remote control back here. And then I am part of a team that covers electricity, energy transportation, which includes pipelines. We also cover fuels, vehicles, and refining. Geopolitics, which has been a little exciting lately, of course, oil, natural gas, and coal, which has been like a roller coaster, power alternatives, and US policy more broadly. And this is because we have financial institutions as our clientele, we have to disclose that there are risks, like everything that happened today could change tomorrow, which I think everyone is very sensitive to these days. So what I'd like to start with is to give you a sense of how infrastructure reviews are creating hurdles to infrastructure solutions. And this is part of a challenge that we see for project sponsors in the following respect, is that careful permitting, which is something I think a lot of people really feel is necessary and important in order to be appropriate stewards of our environment as well as our economy, means that there's a lot that a project sponsor has to go through before they ever turn a shovel or put a piece of infrastructure in the ground. And that ranges from the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act at the federal level through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Rivers and Harbors Act when we cross rivers, Minerals and Leasing Act when we cross federal forests and other federal lands, the Forest Management Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, so we don't tear up the things that are important to us, particularly for tribes. The Endangered Species Act, which has been very prominent in infrastructure issues lately, as well as the Natural Gas Act as overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And if that laundry list weren't enough, there's state permitting, there's federal delegation of Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act permits, the delegation of Coastal Zone Management Acts, which is important for LNG export facilities, plus state level permits. And all of those permits can be challenged on judicial review. So this is something that when we go through the process of evaluating infrastructure needs, there is a time component to it that is problematic when we're in the middle of an energy transition. So to talk a little bit about, I want to give you 3 examples, one each from oil infrastructure, one from natural gas, and one from transmission lines, just to set the stage here for the conversation that's going to continue. The first is the Line 3 replacement project up in the Dakotas in Minnesota. This is a line that brings oil down to our refineries here in the United States and the Gulf Coast. Our refineries moved away from light sweet crude after the first big Iranian oil crisis back in the 70s, and retooled so that they could process the heavier crude that's available in Canada and in the South American countries such as Venezuela. So this pipeline is old and it's at risk of leaking, and what the operator Enbridge wants to do is to replace it, and they want to decommission the current line and they want to recommission a new line. And the statute in Minnesota that oversees infrastructure permitting doesn't actually address the specific question of replacing infrastructure. And because the pipeline is old, it has been running lower than current capacity at about 390,000 barrels a day, and will be, when it's rebuilt at very close to its current diameter, it would actually be able to carry 760, which is what its original capability was, 760,000 barrels per day, of course. So the question that has been looming here is whether or not this pipeline is needed as we contemplate moving into more renewable energy, as we contemplate, diversifying away from oil because of its carbon intensity, particularly heavy oils such as those available in Canada, like from the tar sands. And so one of the real questions that's legally going to play out, even though this project has been re-permitted, is whether or not it's allowed to go from 360,000 barrels a day, which is the current asset's capability, to replacing like for like and being at 760 again. So this is an interesting conundrum of how things pass over time when the statutes themselves don't address a particular situation. There's significant litigation risk then around this project. As was mentioned earlier, natural gas has not been a good time. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline has been stymied by failures in its approval process. It was successfully certificated under the Natural Gas Act by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission back in 2017, but is only about 6% complete because it has had problems not in its FERC authorization, but in the Endangered Species Act authorizations issued by the Interior Department's Fish and Wildlife Service, flawed permitting by the Forest Service, which is part of the Agricultural Department, and a flawed permit under the Clean Water Act for the 404 program in terms of the nationwide 12 permit program. So it's lost, in addition to those 3 key federal permits, several others that has kept it from being constructed on time. Now, construction has been stalled since December of 2017, and it's now March of 2020. And we've had an administration change in Virginia, and we've had a movement in North Carolina pushing back on the utility authorizations that were going to replace coal combustion generation with natural gas combustion, because in the 5 years it has taken since this project was first initiated at FERC, they've decided, a lot of customers have decided that they want more renewable energy. Lastly, the New England Clean Energy Connect is a transmission line that is intending to bring Canadian hydropower down to New England. It is low carbon base load. It is a great opportunity for New England, which is very conscious about their emissions profile, to access nearby energy. However, the states that it will cross, in this case in particular Maine, have raised concerns about the greenfield component of the project. And even though the governor supports it, there's been a ballot initiative to ask the legislature to reconsider that approval. And if the legislature doesn't reconsider it, they're actually going to put it to a vote in November. So this project, which has a lot of fabulous green attributes when you're looking at an objective in New England to decarbonize their power system, it's having very significant problems on the ground in terms of the landowners and the communities it actually touches. So with that sort of setting the table, I'll leave it there and pass the baton.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Let's go over to John Hall now with EDF. John.
Thank you. Let me begin by providing some context for the comments that I will make. From my perspective, air pollution in urban areas across the United States, including the Houston area, is responsible for 2 key challenges that need to be addressed. The first is the challenges of priority pollutants, which contribute to ozone formation, as well as particulates which threaten human health. And the second one, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions, which are contributing to climate change. I believe that reducing these pollutants is an absolute necessity in order to improve public health, address climate change, and ensure the long-term viability of Texas' very robust industrial sector. Fortunately, technology development and innovation in the state's electricity sector, as well as forthcoming changes in the transportation sector, will provide, in my opinion, cost-effective options to address these challenges. Over the next 10 years, I believe that those key options will blossom, and they include 2 key items. The first is the growth of clean energy resources, which includes wind and solar power, along with energy efficiency, storage resources, and the increasing tendency of homeowners and businesses' desire to generate their own electricity. And secondly, the electrification of on-road and off-road roads are charged as the greener. Texas, currently, there are 3 non-attainment areas in Texas. Those include the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area, Houston, Galveston, and more recently, the San Antonio area. Go to the next slide, please. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, has concluded that NOx is the pollutant that needs to be reduced to ensure attainment of ozone standards in these non-attainment areas. And as this particular slide indicate, across the state, 50% of NOx emissions are coming from vehicles. Next slide, please. Within the 3 non-attainment areas, even NOx emissions from vehicles exist at even higher levels. 78% in Dallas-Fort Worth, 67% in Houston, and 58% in San Antonio. Next slide, please. According to reputable sources, the transportation sector in Houston is also the primary emitter of various carbon emissions. I'm not sure, I have some concern as to whether or not it's 84% as projected in this slide and retrieved from reliable sources, but certainly a majority of the carbon emissions emitted in Houston are coming from vehicles. Next slide, please. At EDF, we have completed analyses that quantify the emissions from different types of medium and heavy duty vehicles, including those fueled by diesel, CNG, and electricity. We have computed those emissions under 2 different scenarios. First is life cycle total emissions of the different fuel sources that we believe will be powering vehicles in the future. And the other one is tailpipe emissions. Next slide, please. We have done extensive research with regard to emissions from different types of transit buses. Our analysis shows that electric vehicles, when deployed, electric transit buses have the potential to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, approximately 2/3 from diesel and CNG vehicles. And one of the things I want to point out in this slide is that in Texas, there has been significant effort for CNG to be used to power vehicles. CNG does substantially reduce NOx emissions, which is one of the pollutants that contribute to ozone formation, but actually emit more GHGs than diesel and approximately 75% more than electric vehicles in terms of total emissions life cycle emissions. Next slide, please. In this slide, it shows that electric vehicles from a total emission standpoint substantially reduce the level of NOx and VOCs that are emitted in comparison to diesel and CNG vehicles. So from our perspective in time, the electric vehicles would become one of the most cost-effective options that exist to reduce pollutants that contribute to ozone formation as well as greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. This shifting from total emissions or life cycle emissions, this slide depicts tailpipe emissions from diesel buses to the left, to my left, CNG vehicles toward the center, and electric vehicles to the far right. With regard to electric vehicles, tailpipes emissions are completely eliminated for NOx, VOCs, and greenhouse gases. Further, if clean energy is used to charge electric vehicles, or as the grid becomes cleaner because of increased use of wind and solar power and other clean energy resources, the opportunity will exist for the electric vehicles to reduce tailpipe emissions even more. Next slide, please. Also, very importantly, there has been great progress made in the manufacture and the deployment of electric transit buses. Today, when one considered the upfront cost of different types of buses and the cost of maintenance and fuel over the useful lives of these vehicles, which is approximately 13 years, electric transit buses already are more cost effective than diesel and CNG than diesel and CNG fuel buses. For diesel, the savings is approximately $160,000 over the useful life of that vehicle. And for natural gas, it's approximately $50,000. Next slide, please. In addition to the significant opportunities that will exist in time to reduce both health emissions and carbon emissions through the deployment of electric vehicles, another major change that is underway is the growth of clean energy in the Texas electricity market, particularly the competitive market that is operated by ERCOT. Currently, approximately 23% of the electricity used in this state on an annual basis is from wind power. And ERCOT is projecting that that resource will continue to grow. Additionally, ERCOT is projecting phenomenal growth of solar power over the next 10 years and beyond in the range of 25,000 to 30,000 megawatts, which means that in Texas, the ERCOT competitive market is driving the growth of clean energy resources so that they will contribute up to approximately 50% of the electricity we are using in this state by 2030. Today, wind and solar power are the cheapest sources of electricity on the Texas grid and are virtually emissions-free, and over time can save enough water that will be sufficient to meet approximately a third of our rapidly growing population. This particular slide summarizes pending electric generation projects that have initiated the process of potentially being developed in coming years. A substantial proportion of these projects will not materialize for various reasons. But very importantly, 95% of the pending projects are solar and wind projects. And there are actually more resources pending than natural gas, and there are no coal-fired generation projects pending. For summer 2020, the growth of wind and solar over the past year has enabled ERCOT to increase its reserve margin from last year of approximately 7.5% to about approximately 10.5%. And the grid operator is projecting that over the next 4 years, the growth of solar power in particular and coastal wind will drive the reserve margin to somewhere between 10% to 18%. Now, that means we believe that most coal capacity within the state of Texas will be pushed off the grid by 2035 due to the fact that it cannot compete within the ERCOT market. That means that solar power, which has a capacity factor of almost 75% in summer, when we use the most electricity, is on track to be able to replace the coal generation that would be pushed off the grid. Some are concerned about that. From an environmental perspective, and I also believe from a grid reliability standpoint, that's all good news, because approximately 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in the electricity sector is from coal-fired generation. So consider this. We have the opportunity over the next 10 years, not because of regulation, but because of competitive market forces, to move to a low carbon grid where priority pollutants have been substantially reduced. Greenhouse gas emissions in this sector have been substantially reduced by 2/3 and are paving the way for us to achieve significant reductions in the transportation sector as well, because we believe that because of growing concern about air pollution in urban areas and climate change, consumers and businesses will shift, particularly between 2025 and beyond, to electric vehicles, because they will be more cost effective, and from a tailpipe emission standpoint, which are the emissions used in terms of affecting ozone levels, those emissions will be virtually zero from those vehicles. In cities like Houston, trash trucks, transit buses, school buses will run through neighborhoods without outputting air pollution, thereby improving the public health of our children and our citizens in a cost-effective manner. Thank you.
And thank you, John. You brought up so many things along with Christy that we're going to be able to ask questions about. You know, you're talking about all these different ways of change that is coming and is underway in the Texas energy market, where we're getting more from wind and more from solar, but those are in places that were not where the old coal-fired plants used to be. How are you going to move that energy? How are you going to move that electricity? How will that grid work? So those could be questions that you might want to ask. Right now, this is the time to get those questions in. Go to uh.edu/energy/ask. It's on the screen right now, and submit your questions. Let's go now next to Ed Hers from U of H. Ed.
Thank you, Dave. Let's see, are we on the screen here? I think I got it. I do. All righty. And so as the economist, I'm going to step back and kind of take a look at the macro picture, if you will. There's no question that we have a significant change underway in energy infrastructure. As John spoke about, at the moment, actually, electric vehicles are more cost competitive than gasoline-fired vehicles, even after the price of gasoline falling below $2 a gallon. The challenge is I can't quite get an electric vehicle to go up to Dallas from Houston. And so that's been the roadblock, if you will, for consumers. But with Ford and General Motors all following Tesla, I think there's no question the consumer is going to drive this transition. What I see in terms of the overall picture is there's a fundamental tension of competing constituencies, and Christy has spoken about this. She's in Washington. She sees this day in, day out. The list of regulatory reviews that she put up is really kind of a very small Cliff Notes approach. It's corporations versus government, environmentalists versus corporations, government versus environmentalists, investors with consumers, ratepayers, taxpayers, voters, corporations, venture capitalists. They can't make any rates of return because technology changes in the new and renewable energy space about 20% a year. And so before, for example, we could start a solar plant and get it to market, somebody's got a newer technology 24 months from now. And what we also see is consumers are voters. And sometimes they don't quite get the picture that, for example, the ratepayer is subsidizing the voter, or the voter has decided to subsidize the ratepayer. So I'm going to step back and kind of take a look at where we are in these different markets. Who grows and who doesn't. And so the first view is we're living in a network economy. What happens with A impacts B. Transport from B to C impacts A. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with oil from the Middle East and the Texas shale plays, or whether you're dealing with natural gas in the Marcellus and no pipe, as Christy pointed out, to the Northeast, or transmission lines from West Texas to East Texas, where the population are. And so one of the things that we've really kind of encountered is that GDP growth, economic growth, technological growth has outstripped the infrastructure that we've had in place since the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So let's put the oil market in perspective. That's near and dear to our hearts right now. The US consumes about 18 million barrels a day, of which we produce about 12.5 million barrels a day. We export about 3 million barrels a day because our production doesn't line up with what our refineries require. And so day in, day out, we're importing about 8 to 9 million barrels a day in a 100 million barrel a day market pre-virus. So the challenge we've got here is we're very dependent upon world oil markets and what occurs in them. And this myth of energy independence needs to be bashed once and for all. I don't know if we're ever going to get there. But as long as we're importing, we're exposed to any kind of actions in the world oil markets that could either drive the price down, as we're seeing correct right now, or drive the price up in the event of some massive supply outage. And why this matters is, and to be the economist here, a minus 0.047 price elasticity of demand means that for a 1% excess of quantity on the market, the price goes down 25%. So that's 1 million barrels a day in a 100 million barrel a day world market. Over this past winter, we had a warm January, which generated 800,000 barrels a day less consumption. Now we have the impact of the virus with just the airlines reducing their traffic. That's almost 1 million barrels a day of less consumption. And so it doesn't take long for a market that is used to consuming almost on a just-in-time basis 100 million barrels a day. It's not going to take too much longer for this to really just kind of push all the way back to the wellhead. And hence, we've got prices for WTI in the 20s. Let me go ahead. And the US natural gas market in perspective, let's look here. The advent of fracking that really came in at the beginning of the century, we've got 31 TCF consumption in 2019 versus 23 TCF in 2008. The price is down more than $6 an MCF. This gain to consumers across the board is $195 billion annually, and almost $1 trillion if we look ahead at what's happened over the last 10 years. Now, this benefit has led to really the pushing of coal plants out of the electricity mix and a reduction in CO2 emissions across the board. It's not a perfect solution, but it's become a cheap and useful solution for reducing emissions as we make a transition here. Why invest in pipelines? So one of the great challenges we've had is interstate pipelines. As Christy pointed out, we've got the Atlantic Pipeline project, which has been pending for a number of years, more than 10 years. We have millions of potential customers in the Northeast who are still consuming dirty fuel oil, who are still handicapped by bringing in some gas from LNG. So the guys in Boston pay the same for LNG as do the consumers in Tokyo. When 400 miles away, we've got wells in the Marcellus that could deliver natural gas to them for 1/3 of the cost of what they're paying today, and it would be cleaner. One of the great challenges historically with federal regulation of pipelines is that no one wants them to make too much money. And Paul McAvoy, in an analysis some years ago, pointed out that the rates of return available to these pipes are so low that it's very difficult to attract capital to invest. And so we see capital going to other industries and perhaps not going where we need it most to deliver cheaper energy. And the consequences of having a mismatch of pipeline capacity are what we saw here in the 2000-2001 market. Gas can go into the Waha in the Permian at essentially $2.50 an MCF and comes out in California as much as $12.50 an MCF. That's because there was not enough capacity to deliver the natural gas there. And we'll talk about what happened in California here shortly. John brought up the issues with ERCOT, and ERCOT is a interesting construction. The former chairman of California Independent System Operator called Texas a socialist market because of the way this is structured. It's a monopsony market. There's one buyer for generated electricity. And if we take a look at it across the year, the average wholesale price is less than the average total cost. So this means that generators really are not having a whole lot of incentive to add capacity. And in fact, the electricity generators have an incentive to withdraw capacity to drive prices up. And we saw a lot of that this past summer as we had a very tight situation. It's not the reserve margin that really matters. It's who turns on during the day that drives the prices in the market. But keeping in mind that the generated part is kind of competitive. Well, under the ERCOT model, generators have to bid to come in. And so 70% of the rest of the electricity bill is totally regulated. That's the transmission companies and the distribution companies. We have guaranteed profits, if you will, for transmission companies. Wherever they put a line, they have to apply to the Public Utility Commission. They're granted a wire. Otherwise, we never would have had the wires from West Texas bringing the wind energy to the population centers. In that regard, the wind companies have benefited from essentially a feed-in tariff. It's just the taxpayer asking the ratepayer to pick up the difference, and that's what's happened here. The wholesale price for wind, of course, is really kind of low, and in fact, at various points can become negative. So Tuesday afternoon in ERCOT, there was an electricity shortage in the Permian Basin, and we see prices there going way up. up to what, $90 a kilowatt hour, which is really quite high if you get up to that $9,000 per megawatt hour hit. And then along the valley, where we have negative prices, and so generators are actually having to give away electricity just to keep the generators functioning. And this varies by day, and so it's a great illustration, if you're not doing anything while you're sequestered at home, just to log on to the ERCOT website and take a look at how the prices in the real-time market here change. And then, of course, we've got a situation like we have in August, where the strain on ERCOT became really apparent, and there was just not enough electricity to go around. You know, the hottest days in Texas are quite honestly the days when the wind doesn't blow. And the electricity-only market, just to kind of illustrate this, if you know, the capacity is expected to be 75,000 megawatt hours at peak, say for August, across the rest of the year, the average is about 40,000 megawatt hours of consumption. And so with an electricity-only market as we have in ERCOT, that means the standby generation, the 35,000 megawatt hours of generation capacity, is not earning anything. You could liken this to when the Astros are on the field. Only those 10 players, remember we have the designated hitter, only those 10 players on the field at that day are making anything on an electricity-only market basis. The other folks on the bench aren't getting paid, and in this particular circumstance, that's what happened, and that's the way the ERCOT market is set up as a monopsony. Some markets, such as PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, that Christie's very familiar with, have a capacity market, in which case folks are paid to kind of stay on the sidelines. ERCOT's made some moves in that direction, but really not quite enough. And it's very difficult to plan ahead with the addition of new capacity. There have been regulatory compact failures, and so it's interesting to see Northeast utilities in 95, 96, 25 felonies. You know, they were so focused on improving their profit line, their margins, that they cut back on operations and maintenance expenditures for Millstone 1, Millstone 2, and Millstone 3, 3 nuclear power plants in Niantic, Connecticut. And at the time they shut these plants down, you know, any given day, Boston or New York City would have been in great danger. They found that Millstone 1 was too dangerous to rehabilitate and rebuild. But that's 25 felonies. Then we look at PG&E's bankruptcy in 2001. Due to the way California began its deregulatory proceedings, PG&E got capped at selling electricity for 9 cents a kilowatt hour when it costs them up to 22 cents a kilowatt hour. This led to the removal of Governor Gray Davis and bankruptcy of PG&E. Further, we see the breakdown of the regulatory compact with PG&E's San Bruno pipeline explosion in 2010, and then the campfire in 2018. For regulated utilities to try and improve on their bottom lines, typically they cut costs, they cut maintenance expenditures. The regulatory authorities really don't want to increase rates. They find that that's a detriment to re-election, if you will. And so it's very interesting to watch the voter control what's going on with the ratepayer. Now, recently in Texas, CenterPoint lost a rate case primarily because of poor reliability. And as it turned out, the CEO lost his job. It is an issue of corporate governance. It's an issue of who's going to take the lead, who's getting compensated for this. And it makes a big difference in the electricity market as we move more and more to utilizing electricity, especially for automobiles and transportation. You know, some of the estimates are for a full grid upgrade, we're looking at $2 trillion to update everything from a 1950s architecture. We have to have the accommodations for the electric vehicles, renewable energy. That actually failed during the Camp Fire, because even though consumers in California had solar panels on their homes, they actually were wired into the grid before the homeowner could use the electricity. So as PG&E would take down the grid, the solar panels became inactive for the homeowners. Distributed power, as John pointed out, more and more consumers are looking to have their own power or microgrids. This is a very expensive option versus, say, paying 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Anyone adding a backup generator to their backyard understands this. Anyone paying to have solar panels installed on their homes understands this. Additional issues, hardening against natural disasters. Here in Texas, we understand that with hurricanes. In California, the issues are fires and earthquakes. Hardening against EMPs, because electromagnetic pulses. This was a big issue that many people in national security consider as one of the leading problems. And then hardening against cyber attacks. Every day, the grid is under attack from all sorts of agents, domestic and foreign. And so there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. And the issue facing us as consumers and voters is, how do we get it paid for? How do we compensate folks to go ahead and repair the infrastructure and get us to a point where we can make it through the rest of the century? And so here are some references. And Dave, I guess we're ready for questions.
Yeah, Ed, thanks so much. And you bring up a good point there that makes this hit home with anyone who lives in the Houston area with CenterPoint and the firing of the CEO. There had been testimony before a committee there in Austin about how, from HEB, the big grocery store chain, about how they were spending enormous amounts of money on emergency generators because they felt that CenterPoint's unreliability problem was so severe they were losing power multiple times in one day. They had some of their folks testify about how often it was going off. And nobody apparently could really explain to them why that was happening. So they went and bought their own generators, and they're permanently installed at their grocery store sites now to alleviate the problem. So we've got lots to talk about. I want to bring this, I would kind of put everything we've talked about on pause for just a second, because I think there's kind of an elephant in the room, coronavirus. We're all working at home, doing all these things. How does that right now, how is that affecting, or might that affect, have any impact on the energy infrastructure, whether it's the electrical grid or moving oil and gas around through pipelines? Christy, you want to address that in just a fairly short answer, but because we talk about that all afternoon. But yeah, is there anything, what's the talk right now about what this whole pandemic is going to do when it comes to people not going to work? And some of those folks are there to ensure the reliability of things like pipelines and electrical grids.
Well, what we have heard from both the pipeline sector as well as from the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for the investor-owned utilities, is that they are taking lots of precautions. They are taking care of their operational personnel, of course, very carefully in terms of limiting access of non-essential personnel to facilities. And they think that they can, weather this pretty well. One of the good things about everybody not going to work is that we do have a little bit less demand, although it's demand that is at homes instead of at office buildings during the day. So we have to be careful and pay attention to how the system is managing. But what we need to do is make sure that, that the operations are set. And then the only limitation that they're currently concerned about is, the utilities in particular have an outstanding program of assisting each other in times of crisis. You've seen, I know that folks down in Houston saw utility teams from all over the country come down after the hurricanes in a couple of years ago. And so that may be limited because of limitations on travel. So I think from an operational perspective, we're okay on the infrastructure side, barring any unexpected emergencies, and we just don't know. I mean, this is a very odd time right now, and things like cybersecurity risks and other concerns don't disappear just because there's a coronavirus out there. So everybody has to be on their toes, but right now the infrastructure is feeling that they're fairly well positioned, certainly compared to producers of oil and gas that are taking it totally on the chin right now.
And Ed and John, any thoughts on that?
I'll comment about the ERCOT market. From our perspective, we will probably have less electricity demand potentially through the summer. But ERCOT issued a report approximately 10 days ago, which showed that because of the growth of wind and solar, coastal wind and solar, ERCOT was in a much better position as we approached summer 2020 than summer 2019 and the 2 years before. So from our perspective, we think, first of all, we think ERCOT is the best grid operator in the country. And we think that because of their expertise and their demonstrated ability to integrate variable renewable energy resources into the grid, that we should be okay. But I will hasten to add that during Secretary Perry's tenure at DOE, they released a study that showed that it is cost effective in Texas beyond any other source of electricity to reduce energy use through cost effective energy efficiency programs by approximately 18 to 20% over the next 10 years. And we believe that that course of action should be taken because it will reduce consumers' electricity bill, substantially reduce all kinds of emissions, and improve grid reliability.
And Ed, any thoughts on coronavirus and the energy infrastructure?
Sure. To follow up with John, when I was at DOE in 1980 at the Office of Conservation and Solar Energy, conservation pays for itself very rapidly. And so that's always been the case. The great challenge with ERCOT is because you have 40% of the capacity sitting on the sideline during any given year, any given time, even through the cycle, is you have to be able to count on that capacity coming online when it's required. And there have been several major localized outages across ERCOT, Dallas in February of 2011, when ERCOT wound up having what they call euphemistically a load shedding period of time when it's, we call it a blackout. If someone's not getting paid to keep a generator available to operate, it may not be there. It's like you're having your grandfather's car in the garage. You drive your Tesla back and forth, but hey, here comes a hurricane. We've got to get everybody out of town. Will grandpa's car start if I haven't started it in 10 months, 12 months? Will the tires be inflated? And that's one of the great challenges with the ERCOT construction. Coronavirus is not going to have too much of an impact there. We're going to see reduced demand over this period of time. The tremendous impact, of course, is in the collapsed GDP that we're facing in Texas right now. The lack of transportation, great, gasoline's less than $2 a gallon, but I can't go anywhere. There's no place for me to go. The lack of transportation consumption. The trade war knocked a huge amount off over this past year. The Port of New Orleans had 20% less export loadings, 25% less import loadings or unloadings. We've seen large parts of China shut down. And so that pushes back on the oil supply chain all the way to the wellhead, or as many folks are calling it, demand destruction right now. How long this lasts, in addition to having the Saudi price war on top of this, is anybody's guess. If the virus enforces less economic activity for the next 3 to 4 months, we're going to see some real economic hurt in the oil and gas industry across Texas. Is it an issue for everybody? Well, coronavirus shutting maybe as much as 5 to 10% off of GDP if it were to extend our home office for 6 months, this is going to be really quite devastating for that part of the industry.
Can you bring up the Russians? If we have more time, maybe we'll circle back to you and ask you if the Russians are having, think this is all just working out really, really well at the point that they've been able to start flooding the market and then have this thing happen to us. Let me get back to the kind of the topics at hand with infrastructure and the whole topic of what we're talking about here with some of these projects that Christy talked about earlier, projects that have been held up. I was thinking of the one, here in Texas running across the hill country. If you talk about building a highway for somebody, or maybe giving them a new subway station, new airport, improving their infrastructure, they love that. But talk about putting a pipeline through the hill country, and suddenly all these ranchers come out and say that's not such a great idea. What's the Trump administration's impact been on all this? I thought that was supposed to be, grease the process so that it would go, these things would go through quicker. Is that really what's happening? Because it seems like we're hearing about still a lot of projects being held up. Christy, if you want to take that, and whoever else.
I believe you're talking about the Permian Highway project, right? The
Permian Highway, yes.
Yes, the Permian Highway project. Well, interestingly enough, that one's not FERC jurisdictional, so we can't put that problem at the Fed's door. That is actually an issue with the how the balance of equities is assessed in Texas. And landowners who believe two things: one, that they deserve more of a say in eminent domain proceedings, as well as concerns related to Endangered Species Act, which is a federal issue. So that is certainly some chemistry that we're seeing going on. And the Trump administration has sought not only to change how the National Environmental Policy Act regulations work in an effort to streamline that process for pipelines, as well as for highways and roads and barges and canals and a whole bunch of other stuff that is subject to NEPA. But it is also talked about revisiting some of the issues with the Endangered Species Act, which is critical to both producers and to pipeline sponsors. So it's and they're getting a lot of pushback, and I think I definitely want to hear John's thoughts on this, because it's one thing to say, okay, let's streamline things so stuff can get done. There are renewable energy projects that would dearly benefit from the expansion of transmission to markets where the customers are located, when they are located where the resource is. And so traversing this need for speed in a certain way to get projects in and adopted and built is certainly, running headlong into, the stewardship obligations we have under existing and potentially future statutes. So it's a challenge, and it doesn't seem to be taking less time. The environmental community is becoming phenomenally more sophisticated. It is not an avalanche of postcards at FERC anymore. It is very targeted criticisms of the analysis that is presented to FERC, for example, or to the Fish and Wildlife Service, really testing and challenging the conclusions those agencies are making. And I think in the long run, that improves the permit in terms of its robustness on judicial review, but it takes more time and it takes more money. And as I mentioned, then the question is if you hold a project up for 5 years, then does the customer at the other end have buyer's remorse and decide they want to do something else?
And John, your thoughts on that?
Well, when I was at the State Environmental Agency a long time ago, I took the position that it was important that we have the resources to efficiently review permits as they came in. We put forth an effort and we eliminated permit backlogs that had existed for quite some time. And we were able to do that without compromising, from my perspective, environmental requirements. So I think, I can't speak of other states, but in Texas, there are fees that regulated entities are paying to underwrite the cost of, for example, the TCEQ staff. Unfortunately, the legislature has not appropriated all of those monies to the agency, and environmental reviews tend to take too long. I think that it's important, although I believe that environmental protection is important, I believe that it's also important to efficiently process things. and to have the resources to make sure that appropriate reviews are being conducted. But we're making decisions timely.
And Ed, any thoughts on that about how these projects that are so desperately needed and yet are facing this kind of opposition, what can the Trump administration effectively do to speed those things up, or is it doing that?
Well, you know, in effect, they'd be pushing on a string. I don't know, but Christy, you can help me with this. If we have a full complement of FERC commissioners, for a while we didn't, and so FERC was kind of hamstrung by the lack of a quorum. You know, the president came out 3 weeks ago in favor of the Atlantic pipeline and talking about pushing it through, but really we're not seeing a whole lot of action in that regard. You know, they talked about bringing in the Keystone XL pipeline. Well, that hasn't yet come into operation or construction. You know, the local pipelines here in Texas, it's remarkable that these have been held up just from, it runs counter to the can-do, get-it-done approach of Texas commercial interest and government. But the administration, you know, hasn't been really actively against anything, and but the efforts that they've tried to expend and going forward really haven't been effective.
Well, I think that from the Trump administration's perspective, they have had a lot going on. And I would agree that some of the proposals, particularly on the modifications to the NEPA regulations, the National Environmental Policy Act regulations, were slower than a lot of folks expected, and they've only recently been proposed. So the comments just actually ended last week. So I think that, you know, there is a bit of slowness compared to what a lot of folks in the energy industry expected. In terms of the FERC quorum, FERC currently has, well, it depends on how you count it. There has been a newly confirmed Republican commissioner who is yet to be sworn in. And when he is sworn in, they will have 4 until Bernie McNamee departs, as he is elected not to be renominated at the end of his term in June. So we will go back to having 2 Republican commissioners and 1 Democrat commissioner and 2 empty seats. And no party can have more than 3 commissioners at one time. Is that slowing the reviews down? Actually, FERC has had an outstanding record on judicial review for their permits under the National Environmental Policy Act. What has hamstrung Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which is going from the Marcellus down into the Carolinas and Virginia, has been the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service permits. So we've had some very talented lawyers on the environmental side find flaws in those permits, and they are pretty big. Constitution Pipeline, which is the one that is been shelved recently by Williams, that one is was going to head up to Wright, New York, and connect to pipelines further on into Boston to meet needs up there. That one's been shelved altogether, and that one fell apart over a state review over a Clean Water Act water quality permit. And so you have a lot of tension, and there's not, you know, the EPA has proposed constraining the ability of states to use Clean Water Act Section 401 to veto veto a FERC-approved pipeline, such as in the case of Constitution, but that hasn't been finalized yet either. So I think your criticism of the speed of the administration in adopting what they've articulated as their efforts to streamline is shared by many folks in the energy complex who are frustrated that these promised reforms, which they hope will assist future projects, will get done. And now that we're looking at this demand drop and an oversupply situation for the foreseeable future, you know, it hasn't helped anybody who's stuck now. And, you know, it is arguably a good time to push things forward, but we're getting close to an election, and that sort of gums up a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm. Something Christy brought up was about greenhouse gas emissions. This is a little bit different question, but should greenhouse gas emissions be considered in energy market prices? And if that's the case, what would be the best way to do that, to price in greenhouse gas emissions in market prices? Any thoughts on that from anybody on the panel?
Come on, Ed, you're my economist.
You got it. And so I've been in favor of greenhouse gas taxes on a per BTU basis, per ton basis. This would help accelerate the departure from coal-fired power plants. It would also help accelerate the departure from fuel oil in the Northeast. Again, just on price differentials right now, post-virus, I guess, we're a little closer to parity, but still, oil burns 30% more or produces more 30% pollutants and CO2 than natural gas does. And so in the Northeast, there's this entrenched infrastructure delivering fuel oil to everyone's home. One of the pipeline providers tells me that he's got 250,000 potential customers within a mile and a half of the termination in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And, this could help spur some economic development if we made that transition. Going ahead with a carbon tax, as some states have done, as the Northeast New England region has, as California has done, will help accelerate a transition to electric vehicles and to greater conservation. We're all in this together. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. The work by Tony Lasirowitz at the Yale Climate Communications group points out that 76% of all registered voters are in favor of doing something to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. That means it's a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats. And at some point, the voter needs to step up to it and get it done. Every elected politician, on the other hand, knows that if the price goes up at the pump or if the price goes up at the meter, they don't get reelected. And this is an election year.
And Ed, is that always the case where you have the electorate that on one hand is saying we need to do things to reduce greenhouse gases and slow down climate change, and yet when you say let's do some of these infrastructure projects that would bring maybe more wind power across Texas, but you have to build the grid to do that, there's opposition. Is that one of the big challenges? Is just to get the electorate to understand what is really necessary when it comes to making those changes that they say they advocate?
Well, absolutely. But the fabulous thing about Texas is we have built the grid to bring the wind energy to market, and so the ratepayer winds up paying for it because the voter, by way of the legislation, by way of the governor and the Public Utility Commission, have approved it. The ratepayer, aka voter, doesn't always see this happening, and so. I consider it kind of a backdoor that we've been able to develop this feed-in tariff to accommodate the growth of wind energy in Texas, and we continue to do so. Building wind plants along the Gulf Coast, we're a lot closer to infrastructure. The cost of tapping into the transmission lines won't be as significant as it has been to bring that electricity from West Texas. Across the United States, there's a wonderful book out by Russell Gold on superpower, basically chronicling Mike Skelly of Houston in his effort to bring a power line, a major power line from wind-producing regions to consumer regions, and the great difficulties that he had crossing state lines, crossing different legal authorities, and eventually shelving it because there was just no way people wanted this in their backyard.
What do you see as the biggest challenge for infrastructure in terms of trying to go 100% carbon free? What would be the number one thing on a 100% carbon free power grid that right now is the biggest challenge in trying to accomplish that? Anyone?
In Texas, I don't believe 100% carbon-free electricity market is feasible. When you look at the amount of electricity we have to have during summer, to keep the lights on, while we may be able to accommodate coal going off the grid over the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, we recognize that in Texas, where load growth is growing 2% a year, that we will need natural gas in coming years. We would hasten to add, however, that we believe it's important for oil and gas companies to step up, as many are doing, to begin to reduce their methane emissions. And we've demonstrated through studies that that can be done in a very cost-effective manner. But, you know, from my perspective in Texas, as a strong proponent of clean energy, one of the worst things that could happen is for the lights to go off in summer. And I think that would forestall progress for a long time. And we recognize that as we shift from that natural gas generation, for example, emits approximately 50% less carbon emissions than coal. And most of that coal is transported to Texas from Wyoming. So but we are concerned that it is cost effective for methane emissions to be reduced today. And we hope that as we have major oil and gas companies stepping up to address that issue, we are hopeful that we will see more and more do that, or we have the adoption of policies, because that can be done in a very cost-effective manner. I think it's important. My hope is that supporters and producers of oil and gas will recognize that in this environment, where there is almost universal agreement among scientists that the climate crisis is actually worse than they have been projecting, that it's important for these producers and supporters to realize that if they want to ensure their long-term viability, it is imperative that they step up and reduce their methane emissions. And they would also benefit greatly if all of the cars in Texas major urban areas over the next 20 years were electrified. Because that would mean that much of the industrial base in Texas would be able to see less reductions in various emissions because of the significant progress that would have been made in the electricity and in the transportation sectors. I personally recognize that a strong industrial economy is a prerequisite for a consistently growing economy. And all of my training and all of my experience has led me to believe that we can get that done as we also protect the environment. Anyway, that's my perspective.
Yeah, and I just have to follow up with you, John, because you point out about the chance if the lights go out this summer. You talked earlier about wind power creating a bigger reserve margin, and that has increased somewhat. But it sounds like you still have concerns, though.
No. It's actually the growth of solar power.
Oh, solar is the one. Solar
is the resource that's really growing. And it is best when when the temperature is 100 degrees plus. So we actually are in a position this year where the reserve margin is substantially better than it has been in the previous 3 years. And I would add that despite all of the predictions, we had no brownouts during the past 3 summers, and no blackouts. And I credit the expertise of the ERCOT people for doing that, and for them working with generators, all of the generators, to make sure that they did their maintenance work before summer, so that there was sufficient electricity to keep the lights on during our summer peaks. I think we're much better off today. I think we would be much better off for the next 3 to 4 years. And I recognize that West Texas wind is almost off the grid when we have 100-degree temperatures. But we did know something very interesting this past summer, and that is coastal wind comes on the grid starts coming on the grid around 1 o'clock in the afternoon and continues to grow through the evening up until about 9 o'clock. So as West Texas wind is going off the grid, solar is coming onto the grid, and coastal wind is coming onto the grid. No, we are optimistic that even before the potential downturn in the economy because of the coronavirus, that ERCOT is in a better position for summer 2020 than it has been for the previous 3 years. And during those previous 3 years, when the reserve margin was relatively tight, the lights stayed on.
Kristen, you want to comment there? Because I know there's, on both coasts, it seems like there's certainly a lot of problems with electric grids and how they're being managed. John is a big proponent of ERCOT. Who looks at ERCOT and says that is the way to be doing it? Can you duplicate that in other parts of the country, or does anyone necessarily want to duplicate that in other parts of the country?
Well, between you, me, and the light post,
right.
I would not be in any hurry to adopt a capacity market in Texas, because it can be a little bit problematic, because it's not that a capacity market doesn't solve brilliantly for the price of power. It does. The problem is that the assumptions don't always hold from the year that you run the auction to the year that you start delivering the power. And when energy and ancillary services revenues don't wind up being as much as generators planned when they put their bids in for capacity, then what you have is lower returns than folks expected. And we have, for example, an overcapacity problem right now in PJM, which is the grid operator that serves the Mid-Atlantic, where they target a 16.5% reserve margin and they're running at about 28. And so there's a mismatch in terms of the generation that's available. There's a lot of it. Not all of it is as clean or as low emitting as many of the policymakers in the 14 states and parts of states that are part of PJM would like it to be. And we've got some pretty significant conflicts in that multi-state regional grouping in terms of what preferences are in terms of emissions profiles. And that's been very problematic. You have a different issue in New York, where have retired almost all of their coal-fired capability. They are a little tight on gas, but they have a governor who's very aggressive in pushing a transformation of that market. And that grid operator is trying to get the governor to get on board with the idea of putting a carbon price into their single state market. So New York has its own independent system operator. And so he's trying to get support for the idea of adopting a carbon price in New York. You look to the 6 states that are the members of the ISO New England, and even those folks who are not so far apart ideologically when it comes to issues on the environment, they haven't come together to decide on the best carbon mechanism to use in their markets. And that's a challenge for them. You go out to the West Coast and you look at California, and California's had a huge challenge. They had a great uptake in community aggregation programs out there. And then the grid operator said, well, that's all well and good for energy guys, but I need you all to cover your capacity too. And so you've had a whole bunch of community aggregators go out and put folks together, and now they're being handed a bill for incremental capacity coverage and reliability that they don't expect and is, out of step with their business model. So it's a challenge because these markets are great in theory, but sometimes the amount of time it takes to get tariff changes done, to get stakeholders together, to get these things worked out, you wind up with things that get really, really sticky and dysfunctional that cause other problems. And that starts to erode the success of markets. And, I would say in some ways, ERCOT has been fortunate in 2 very big things. One, they're not jurisdictional to FERC. So they only have 1 regulator to contend with, and I can't imagine that hurts anything when you only have 1 audience to please and not 2. And then you also have the CREZ program that was a commitment by stakeholders to say, we're not going to worry about freeloaders under the FERC tariff and open access. We're going to build the asset, and then we're going to assume the wind is going to come. And that happened. Now, that's not the way it works in other parts of the country. There hasn't been that buy-in to build the transmission out first, and then let the, in that case, wind, come in, or community scale solar or utility scale solar come in and interconnect. It's been, someone who builds out to a project and then he doesn't want the guy next door to jump on board. So you've got, things in Texas that are very, very fortunate. And, the question of adopting a capacity market, it's great in theory. And it's great when the only thing you're worried about in price. PJM's market worked best when the only thing that mattered was the price. But now that we're talking about environmental attributes, policy preferences, deep decarbonization, different strategies from state to state, that mechanism is struggling mightily to accommodate those preferences. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of tension in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Northeast right now, is how to meet the desires of states that still have control over generation in a federal framework that is primarily designed to help facilitate transmission.
Ed, would you like to add something there? Because we're ready to start wrapping up, but what are your thoughts on this?
Well, sure. Is it technologically feasible to go carbon free? And it has been for decades, but the electorate has not wanted to go forward with a full fleet of nuclear power plants. In New York ISO, the legislature gave a bailout to the 2 upstate plants. I think it's $500 million. And certainly, that and implied and outstanding cost that's been, the taxpayers have subsidized the ratepayers, if you will, to keep those plants open. They closed Indian Point. California, of course, has all sorts of challenges. Wyoming has a tremendous fleet of wind turbines. They're happy to sell electricity down to California by their power line every day. Looking ahead, would the synthetic photosynthesis that a number of scientists are working on, it works at the lab bench, it works on small models. There's an opportunity for this to go forward because the power would be generated by solar. This could be very intriguing, interesting, and make a full transition in the next 20 years if this works out, at least to a zero carbon cycle situation. It would certainly hasten the end of fossil fuels, at least in the industrialized nations. We can get there. The question is, who wants to make the upfront investment? And right now, no one seems to be willing to do that. And certainly with the current climate this year, I don't think we're going to see very much prior to the election.
Well, on that note, too, of the world having changed so dramatically, so quickly, what are your final thoughts as we wrap things up? We're just about out of time. We started out this discussion with the title, the topic of energy infrastructure, bottleneck or enabler. Go down the line again. Christy, what are your final thoughts on all this? And again, kind of taking into consideration what's on the minds of so many right now with the coronavirus and world challenges.
Well, I think it can be both, of course. I think our panel has certainly amply demonstrated that. I think when we look down the road at an economy that looks like it's going to be struggling for several months, if not longer, and down the barrel of an election, the question is going to be, where do we wind up? Do we wind up with a president that still has a very deregulatory posture? And I think that, we can still see a lot of tension. If we get a swing of the pendulum to a Democrat, then we're going to see a lot more greenhouse gases come back to central decision making. And while that may be uncomfortable for a lot of market participants, the question is could you get some visibility even with that constraint? So those are the big things we're looking at.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. John, your final thoughts.
Lots of things are happening in the electricity markets today. And for those of us who like predictability and stability, what's happening can be unsettling. But I'm a strong believer that technology innovation, sensible people staying in the game to make decisions, can drive us forward in a manner whereby we have the electricity we need and we make progress in reducing carbon emissions as well as other pollutants, because that's what the public is going to insist on. The challenge is to do that in such a way where we don't drive cost up in a significant manner. And I believe that's possible. I'm optimistic. I think the key is to recognize that changes are going to occur. And out of those changes, we need to have the political will to address the compelling public policy issues that need to be addressed, but recognize it's important that the lights stay on for consumers and businesses.
Very good. Ed, your final thoughts on this?
Certainly. With electricity markets, the advent of deregulation, which began in the late 80s and early 90s, came about because many folks had recognized that the vertically integrated market, which was designed to provide 99.999% reliability of delivery of electricity to the consumer, was really expensive. And so if you could get by with 99% reliability, maybe you could save some great magnitude. And so that's what each market has been living with as they've so-called deregulated over the last 25, 30 years. At this moment, we're reaching the point where legacy generation assets are aging beyond their operating life. We've seen the extension of some nuclear plants now to 80 years. Maybe we can continue to do that, but certainly the coal plants and a lot of the gas plants can't go that long. We're going to reach a point where reliability becomes such a problem that the consumer is going to have a tremendous decision to make. Am I going to build generation facilities for myself? Am I going to put in microgrids, like, for example, many of the industrial plants along the ship channel? Or are we going to go ahead and vote for an upgrade to the Texas grid, to the PJM grid, to the California grid? I'm not sure when we're going to get there. We will get there. The economics are just pointing towards an increased payment at some point in the future.
And let me add this real quickly. Self-generation, homeowners generating their own electricity in Texas is growing 60%. And I think that suggests that we're going to see dramatic growth of on-site generation at homes and businesses. And that generation will in large part be distributive solar. And that can be done in a cost-effective manner, depending on how it's financed. And I would say this, we do have an energy poverty issue in this state because we've got 3.7 million households who are paying more than 10% of their electricity, more than 10% of their income on electricity cost. And that's an issue that we need to begin to address in this state.
John Hall and Ed Hers and Christy Tezak, you've given us a lot of things to think about and some great information in which to frame our thoughts about all of this. So we thank you for having taken time. And I know it's tough right now to find time to do a lot of things because suddenly things have gotten busy and sometimes more challenging to do, like when we're trying to do things virtually instead of in person. So thanks to you all, and my thanks to the University of Houston Energy Symposium for inviting me to moderate this afternoon. It's been a lot of fun. I believe we're going to go back to Ramanan for some closing remarks. Ramanan, are you still on the line with us?
Yes, Dave, thank you so much. And that was a terrific panel. Dave, thank you for moderating this wonderful panel. Thanks to John Hall, Christy Tezak, and our own Ed Hers for an absolutely riveting discussion. I do want to assure folks on the who were online and had challenges with the video stream that if you go to our Facebook stream, you will find it immediately available to play and will be available for you for the next week or so at least on our Facebook live stream. After that point, we will have a YouTube video that will be produced from the recordings that we made and will be made available to everybody. I do want to mention to our panelists and the moderator, we had over 70 questions from the audience, really fantastic questions. We will forward those to you And if you choose to, that you want to answer some of those, and we can certainly find a forum to get that back to the audience here. I do want to thank a few people for making this happen. Obviously, our moderator, Dave, and our panelists, but also University of Houston's IT services, as well as all of the staff at UH Energy. Thank you so much for joining us. We do hope that we'll see you back in fall of 2020 with our new series for the UH Energy Symposium series. Thank you so much.
Well, it was great almost meeting everybody.
I'm here.